Jimmy Kimmel's show began, as always, with a cheerful and light atmosphere. He greeted the audience with jokes, often forgetting about the political gravity of current events, always preferring restrained sarcasm in his comments. That evening, Kimmel was ready for something particularly tense. It wasn't just another night in the studio. Jimmy had invited one of the most famous and at times most controversial politicians in the country, Pam Bondi. Today on our show, we have someone who isn't just a politician, but a true Republican star. This is a person whose decisions on women's rights in recent years have become some of the most discussed in the country. Everyone knows her role in the fight against abortions and her special attention to issues of family values. "Pam Bondi, let's welcome her," said Jimmy, and the room immediately erupted in applause. Pam Bondi, with her impeccable, confident demeanor, walked onto the stage. There was strength in her stride. She wasn't just a politician. She was a woman accustomed to being in the spotlight, and she excelled at it. When she sat across from Kimmel, her face remained calm despite the tense atmosphere in the studio. "Pam, glad to see you," said Jimmy, smiling. "You're probably in the thick of the political season, but you still found time for us." Pam smiled back, but her gaze was firm. "Jimmy, it's nice to be here. Politics is a job that demands time, but I believe it's important to also make time to communicate with people who aren't afraid to ask questions." "Yes, I think the questions you ask yourself every day are indeed important," continued Kimmel, teasing her with sarcasm. "But, you know, Pam, your opinions on many issues can actually be quite controversial, especially when it comes to women's rights. How do you decide what's right and what's not?" Pam didn't change her expression. She was used to such questions. The fundamental issues related to women's rights, her political stance on them, it was all part of her public persona. She responded without hesitation. "I do what I think is necessary. In my life, I've always done what I believed was right, even if it contradicted popular opinion." "Yes, you've always been at the center of controversies, and that's exactly why I invited you, Pam," said Kimmel with a slight hint of mockery, noticing how serious she was. "You're one of those people who's always ready to go against the tide. How do you handle the fact that half the country is outraged by your decisions on women's rights?" "I know my decisions provoke protests, but I'm not afraid of those protests. I make decisions with confidence because I believe they're necessary for the country," Pam replied. "Surely you don't think you're violating women's rights when you support laws that limit their freedom of choice?" Kimmel continued, trying to push her into a sharper discussion. Pam raised her eyebrows slightly. She understood that her political position was more than just answering questions. She stood by her principles, and this encounter was no exception. "You don't understand, Jimmy," she began cautiously. "I'm defending the right to life. I support those who can't defend themselves, and I don't believe my decisions limit freedom. On the contrary, they protect those who need it." "So you think restricting women's right to abortion is protecting life?" Kimmel clarified, his voice growing more tense. "Yes," Pam replied, her voice becoming firmer. "I believe the right to life is more important than the right to abortion. It's a matter of morality and ethics, and I'm prepared to defend my views." Kimmel, seeing that Pam wouldn't back down, couldn't resist pressing further. He felt the tension in the studio rising and didn't miss the chance to keep the conversation heated. "Pam, you keep talking about morality and ethics, but don't you see that your decisions create barriers for women who simply want the right to choose? Surely you understand that every woman has the right to decide what happens to her body?" Kimmel pressed, his gaze becoming increasingly intense. Pam responded without delay, her voice remaining firm. "I'm not limiting women's rights. I'm protecting life that begins at conception. That's important. Every woman should have the ability to choose, but not to kill." "But don't you realize that behind these decisions aren't just abstract ideas, but real women whose lives are changed?" Kimmel continued, almost shouting in response. "You talk about the right to life, But don't you think the right of women to choose and control their own bodies is equally important? Pam paused for a moment, but didn't show any weakness. Jimmy, I know this is a controversial issue, but I can't stand on the side of people who think you can just resolve the issue of abortion. I believe it's a threat to the future. A threat to the future? What about the future of women who can't decide for themselves what to do with their bodies? Kimmel asked, his voice filled with disappointment. The audience in the studio was already starting to murmur, sensing the growing tension. Pam, hearing this question, took a deep breath, but wasn't about to concede. She raised her head and, slightly changing her tone, said, "I'm ready to argue, Jimmy, but I believe my decisions are based on something greater than just political choice. These are decisions that concern life, and I can't disagree with that." Pam felt the conversation was starting to become personal. She realized that every answer she gave was no longer just a political statement, but a personal battle with what she had experienced in her career. For her, this topic was too painful, and she tried to keep her emotions in check, but every word from Kimmel pushed her closer to losing her composure. "Do you think your opinion is more important than the opinion of millions of women?" Kimmel persisted, his voice becoming increasingly serious but no less sharp. "My opinion isn't just an opinion," Pam responded. "It's my duty, my responsibility. I have to make decisions that will help society in the future." "You can help society, but don't forget that this society consists of people who also have the right to choose. You might not see this because you're always at the center and your perspective doesn't change. But it's important for people to know that their choice matters too," said Kimmel, his voice becoming calmer but still full of emotion. Pam fell silent. A flicker of doubt appeared in her eyes, but she quickly regained her confidence. "You're right, Jimmy, that every woman should have the opportunity to choose, but I believe it's important to maintain balance, and I will continue to defend my decisions." "Well then," said Kimmel with a smile, but his eyes were full of sarcasm, "I think we've established today that you'll keep defending your decisions, and I'll keep questioning how right they are." The audience finally burst into applause, realizing that the conversation had reached its climax. The situation in the studio remained tense. The audience watched every word closely because this conversation was becoming more than just a show. Pam Bondi seemed unwilling to concede, but cracks were starting to form in her confidence. As Kimmel continued to raise sharp topics, she felt her inner barrier beginning to break. "You know, Jimmy," she said, her voice softer but still firm, "sometimes when you make these kinds of decisions, you have to look to the future. I'm not just defending laws or principles. I'm thinking about how the next generation will live." Kimmel leaned forward, looking at her intently. "Are you saying you know better what people need than they do themselves?" he asked with a hint of irony. Pam, noticing the slight irony in his voice, didn't react to it, choosing to stick to her line. "No, I don't think I know better, but I make decisions with an understanding that it's not just about what we think today, but how it will affect our descendants. We can't afford to just follow the moods of the majority if they're leading us in the wrong direction." "Aren't you afraid of being alone?" Jimmy asked with a slight smirk. "It seems to me that in this situation, you could easily find yourself isolated. Aren't you afraid that your decisions will ultimately be deemed wrong?" Pam felt her chest tighten with tension, but she didn't show that his words had affected her. She knew this question was a provocation and restrained her response. "Sometimes you have to be alone, but I'm not afraid of that. I'm confident in my decisions." The audience sensed the conversation was picking up steam again. Kimmel, not giving her time to think, launched another attack. "So, in principle, do you consider women's rights a secondary issue?" he asked, his voice growing colder. "You say you're fighting for the future, but isn't it more important to support the rights of people who are living in that future right now?" "I believe women's rights are important, Jimmy," Pam replied, maintaining her composure. But I also believe that every decision should be made with the common good in mind, and if we allow society to crumble by following fleeting desires, we'll lose everything." Kimmel couldn't resist taking a jab at her. The common good? No matter how you try to justify your decisions, they clearly don't take into account the interests of many women who aren't happy with these decisions. Surely you don't think your fight to protect children's rights violates women's rights? "This isn't a fight against women, Jimmy." Pam snapped back. "I'm not against women. I'm against the destruction of life that begins at conception. I'm against us allowing ourselves to ignore moral principles." The audience fell silent again. Kimmel, feeling that Pam wasn't about to back down, continued his assault. "But you see, Pam, how your position affects people, don't you? How can you ignore the suffering of those who can't access medical services that are so necessary for their health?" Pam raised her head, her eyes as hard as stone. "I'm not ignoring them, Jimmy. I'm doing what I believe is right. And if that means I have to defend a law that might disappoint some people, then I will do it, because I believe it will be better for society as a whole." "But for whom is it better?" Kimmel pressed on, not relenting. "For women who find themselves in difficult situations? For people who are forced to live with these decisions because no one asks what they think?" After another pointed question, Pam felt her patience wearing thin. But this time, her reaction was unexpected. Instead of responding sharply, she paused for a moment and reflected. "You're right, Jimmy," she said, her voice now calmer but carrying deep meaning. "I might never be able to please everyone, but maybe I should listen better to those who disagree with me. We all have the right to our own opinions, and I need to respect that. Sometimes it's important to stop and think, even if you're confident in your righteousness." The audience fell silent, and a hush fell over the studio. This was the moment when Pam, despite all her toughness and stubbornness, acknowledged that it was worth listening to criticism. She took a step back and thought before continuing. "But that doesn't mean I'll change my views," she added, making it clear she wasn't giving up. "I still believe my decisions are for the good of the country, and I'll keep fighting for what I think is right." Jimmy, hearing these words, relaxed a little. He hadn't expected Pam, so firm and unyielding, to admit that it was worth listening to others. This was an unexpected development that made him ease up a bit as well. "Well then," he said with a smile, "I'm glad you at least acknowledged that it's important to listen to those who disagree with you. That's already a step forward." Pam looked at him and gave a slight smile, though her expression remained serious. "Yes, I agree that it's important to listen to others, but my principles remain the same." Kimmel, tilting his head slightly, responded, "Well, Pam, you're certainly an iron lady, but still, sometimes the world changes, and maybe your Republican stance should evolve a bit to take into account the opinions of those who oppose you. Otherwise, your ideology will just become an idea." The audience murmured again, and though their applause wasn't as enthusiastic as usual, it was a moment of acknowledgement. Pam might not have changed her stance on key issues, but at least she was willing to admit that listening to others was important, even if it was difficult. When the show ended, Jimmy Kimmel turned back to the audience, but the lightness was gone from his face. He knew this episode had been monumental, not just for him, but for the entire political landscape. Kimmel and Pam hadn't reached full agreement, but they had at least started an important conversation that might change their perspectives. "Well, friends," said Jimmy, addressing the audience, "this was, perhaps, one of the most interesting conversations of my entire career. Pam Bondi showed that even the firmest political convictions can be questioned, and that's great." After the broadcast, the show became a topic of discussion in the media, and although Pam Bondi didn't change her views, she became more open to discussion. Meanwhile, Jimmy, as always, continued his work, showing that even on serious political shows, important issues can be discussed with a dose of irony and humor. When the show featuring Pam Bondi and Jimmy Kimmel ended, Its impact was felt not only in the studio, but beyond. The entire next day, news agencies and social media were flooded with discussions of this episode. The public was divided. Some supported Pam, some supported Jimmy, but everyone agreed on one thing. It was a moment that couldn't be ignored. On political platforms discussing Republican actions and their views on women's rights, numerous articles analyzing Pam Bondi's behavior appeared. Can politics be humane when principled decisions are at stake? Journalists wondered. Some criticized her for being unable to listen to others, while others claimed that Pam was the guardian of justice. Meanwhile, debates raged on social media. Dozens of memes and quotes from the show emerged. The video of their discussion also instantly went viral. Many, including politicians and public figures, began commenting on what had happened, sharing their perspectives. Kimmel, as always, is brilliant. He doesn't just joke, he asks questions that make you think, one Twitter user wrote. But Pam Bondi isn't one to give up. She keeps defending her position. However, there were also those who questioned her principles, noting that her approach could be much more flexible. She sticks to her guns, but shouldn't she listen to those she disagrees with? Users continued to ask. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi also made her statement on social media. She confirmed that she didn't regret participating in the show, despite the questions Kimmel raised. Sometimes you have to be ready to defend your point of view, even if it causes dissatisfaction. We live in a country where it's important to stand by your convictions, even when the majority opinion might be the opposite, she wrote. A few days after the show, Kimmel sat at his desk, reflecting on how the conversation with Pam had changed. This episode wasn't just another chat with a political guest for him. It was something bigger, a moment that made not only his viewers, but also himself think. He couldn't help but admit that throughout the show, Pam Bondi had demonstrated her resilience and confidence. Despite all her controversial decisions, she remained steadfast in her position. And despite all her rigid views, he couldn't help but notice how she gradually, even if not completely, began to open up to criticism. This was a moment when politics and personal convictions clashed in real time. Yes, I probably pushed a bit too hard, Kimmel thought, sitting in his chair. But that's exactly what makes our show alive. We don't just provide a platform for celebrities or politicians. We show that even the most self-assured people can face questions that make them think. The next day, preparing for a new episode, Jimmy decided to continue with the theme of open dialogue. He realized that the show had now become more than just late-night humor. He wanted to raise issues that truly concerned society, but in a way that the audience wouldn't feel detached from the topic. In his conversation with Pam, he himself saw that even the most rigid political figures could be susceptible to doubt and change. A week later, Pam Bondi agreed to come back on the show. This time, she wasn't as confident as she had been the first time. She clearly realized that their conversation had sparked widespread public resonance, and perhaps this was a chance to change perceptions of her political career. "Pam, glad to see you again," said Jimmy, greeting her. But his tone was different now, softer. He knew this meeting would be different, and that it would yield more than just jokes. "Thank you for the invitation, Jimmy," Pam replied, her voice calm. "I came not to argue with you, but to discuss what we can do next. I don't think my convictions are wrong, but maybe I don't always explain my position correctly." Kimmel smiled, hearing her response. "Well, let's try. We can talk without the jabs. That's important too, right?" "Of course," she nodded. "I understand that my views might be alien to many people, but it's important to me that everyone understands that I'm doing this not to please anyone. I'm standing up for what I believe in." The conversation between them continued in a completely different atmosphere. It wasn't the same heated conflict as in the previous show. Kimmel, of course, didn't miss the chance to ask provocative questions, but now he did so with respect, and Pam responded with greater openness than before. This dialogue wasn't just about politics. It was a conversation about how important it is to find a balance between personal convictions and public opinion. "You know, Jimmy," Pam said after some time, "I can't say that I've always been open to criticism. I'm used to defending my point of view without looking back. But maybe it's important to hear what others are saying." "That's exactly what I wanted to hear," said Kimmel with a smile. "Pam, are you ready not only to argue, but also to acknowledge that your decisions might affect people you don't agree with?" "Yes," she replied, "and I'm willing to take that into account. That doesn't mean I'll change my views, but it's important that everyone feels their opinion matters." A few weeks after the show with Pam Bondi and Jimmy Kimmel, their meeting was no longer discussed as a political dispute, but as a significant moment for democracy and public dialogue. Even those who disagreed with her views acknowledged that she had started to open up to discussion, which in itself was a step forward. In this country, it's important not only to defend your views, but also to be ready to hear what others are saying, Pam said in one of her post-show interviews. "Sometimes you need to not only protect your ideas, but also consider how they might impact others." "Maybe this was the most unexpected conversation of my career," Kimmel said the next day in an interview with journalists. "But I'm glad it wasn't just a show. It was a moment when each of us could learn." After the episode with Pam Bondi and Jimmy Kimmel, the show became a topic of discussion at all levels. Social media was flooded with comments. Some supported Pam, some supported Jimmy, but everyone agreed that this conversation was iconic. Pam Bondi, a recognized political figure who was used to defending her convictions, this time was forced to acknowledge the importance of open dialogue. "Sometimes it's important not only to stand your ground, but also to listen to others, even if their opinion differs greatly from yours," Pam said in one of her interviews, responding to questions about the show. For Jimmy Kimmel, this episode was a lesson. He realized that his show could be not only a source of laughter, but also a catalyst for important discussions. He acknowledged that political dialogue isn't just about sarcasm and humor, but also a serious space for exchanging opinions. "I'm glad we were able to have this conversation with Pam. It reminded me that sometimes it's important not only to ask questions, but also to listen to the answers, even if they're not what you expected," said Jimmy. The audience, in turn, began to reconsider their attitudes toward both politics and its key figures. Despite the tense moments, the show demonstrated that even the most steadfast political views can be questioned and discussed with respect. After the broadcast, Pam Bondi continued to defend her position, but now with a bit more openness, while Jimmy continued to use his show for deeper and more meaningful conversations. This episode proved that even the most complex topics can be discussed with respect and understanding, and that, despite differences in opinion, the process of dialogue itself is what matters.